Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us on the Saturday afternoon. It's the first time we're doing a session in the afternoon, so it's really nice to see like a lot of people showing up for this. Um, this talk we're gonna have Roshan Kumar. People might know him by his Instagram handle as Rollpipe, and he's gonna be taking us through the Rive workflow. So do check out the work, and all the links to his work and our socials will be in the chat through the duration of this talk. And in this talk, he's going to be covering the basics of Rive using a live demo of a small project that he had done, and also showing us potential of using its potential using one of his own projects. So a little bit more about motion sickness for any of the new faces who are joining us today. It was an idea born out of the need to connect with more motion designers in the country, which was proving to be very difficult when like for freelancers. And we started this community in 2022, and we're a growing number currently with the goal to connect all the motion designers and highlight all the kind of work coming out of the country. So the links again will be in the chat. Um, our current endeavors include reposting work on Instagram, which comes out of the country. We have a Discord for discussing all things motion, and we're also sharing sessions that we do, like these sessions, on our YouTube channel. This session will also be recorded, so you can have a look at that once we'll post it sometime, probably next week. So we've also jumped onto LinkedIn, so we're posting our announcements and any major updates out there. So stick around for that too. Um, so yeah, like I said, the recording will be there. This session is being recorded and it'll be there sometime next week on our YouTube channel. And I think that's about it. If you're good to go, Roshan, you can take over.
Just one more thing I'd like to add. For this session, we'll be keeping a little bit of time for question and answers after each section. So we'll let you guys know, and you can just unmute your mic or type it out in the chat if you have any questions. That's all. Thank you.
Cool.
Roshan, you
Awesome.
can go ahead.
Hey, yeah. Let me just share my screen real quick. Also, just a request to Aishwarya and Nikhil. Would it be fine if you guys could like read out the questions that are coming up because I'm on a different window.
Sure, yeah, we can
Not a
do that.
problem.
Awesome, thanks. So hey, I'm Roshan, and welcome to the session. Definitely a lot more people than what I expected, so that's I think a good start. Um, I suck at intros, so I'm a motion designer and an illustrator. So and I've been dabbling with Drive for quite some time, and I will leave my intro at that because, well, as you can see, I'm really not the best at it. Um, so, okay, let's start off with the idea of Drive. Pretty sure it's been doing rounds on the internet for the last couple of months or so, but we started dabbling into it like almost a year back, kind of testing its like feasibility on a product, on a web app, etc. So we kind of, I would say, jumped on the bandwagon a bit more earlier. So we kind of saw it grow from the alpha stage to the beta stage to whatever it is now. And from that buggy piece of software that it was to now becoming something so big, we thought we've seen people do stuff where we've seen them do, interactions and make something fun, bring back the old Flash vibe to back to the web. But the coolest thing about Rive is how it works at scale, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We thought it was a fun thing to look at because uh, the things for the future could also be very dynamic, as we've seen with AI and just how easy it is to make API calls and get so much data now. So incorporating Rive really makes it that much more easy to visualize that data in a much more fun way. So for the process, we usually think analogies. Um, as it is with like interactions and product in general, we're thinking about stuff that already exists in real life. Things skeuomorphic, and even with motion, the idea is we try to kind of uh, uh, kind of go back and forth between the real life examples of how things move, so that way when things do move in a certain specific manner, even though it's not that evident metaphorically and subconsciously. We do understand that there's a, it does get an emotion out of the user. So we kind of think from that perspective for the process of, and I'll keep running back and forth between my Rive editor and my presentation. Let me know if you can see the Rive editor as well. Uh, is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Awesome. So yeah, let's take an example for the sake of this. So let's say the idea is that we have a widget where it's almost like a pet, and the idea is that the pet tells you not specifically, but more like the time of the day it is, more like a very fun widget you would have. And the idea is that the pet would look at the sun and the moon, and it would probably fall asleep after a while. So uh, let's say that's the idea. So when we kind of design stuff like this, we're also thinking about storyboarding and style framing, etc., etc., and they almost are similar to doing explainers. But one thing that takes a bit of a deviation here is for storyboards is that we look at it from a way of creating flows rather than creating a linear structure. And the reason we do that is with Rive, you're creating conditions and algorithms, right? You're saying, if something is this, then do this. If not, do this, right? Or if a number is this, then we show this. Or if a number is not that, or if it's something else, then we do this. Or if it's something else, we do this. So the there's a lot of permutations and combinations that you can do. So with that logic in place, we kind of think about it in that process where it's not about, okay, it's always going to go in like a story kind of a fashion, but more like how would the user interact with this, and if they do this, what do they see next, right? And how do we transition to that state? We got to make it clever, right? You can't just directly make an instant jump to it. You can, but it'd be nicer to have a bit of flow, because would make the interaction seem a lot more smoother, and it would also give them the idea of navigation when users are using such things. So for this instance, we're thinking, well, the analogy, right? What could the analogy be? Well, uh, when we look at how things move, like the sun or the moon, they usually move in a circular fashion, right? So we could kind of utilize that kind of a motion maybe, and we could have the moon pop up. Now, for the sake of this thing, and like in the interest of time, like let's say we do have some constraints and we don't want the whole thing to keep moving around, because we only see half of this thing, right, and not the other half. So if it's a widget of that constraint, then the idea would be that this itself would turn into the moon. And okay, so now that's another idea. And now that when it goes all the way past here, maybe we have the pet following this thing, and once it reaches a certain point, it kind of falls asleep. And again, as the thing rolls back up, you kind of have this following it while it's asleep, and then it wakes up as at a certain point. Now, so that's kind of how the whole ideation process works. And the next thing, scalable constraints. Sorry. Um, and like I said, there's so many constraints when you're thinking about stuff like these, because now we have the thought in place as to what the basic idea looks like, and we can get all creative. Now we enter the technical part of things where we're like, okay, how do we get this to work at a scale? Right? Like, let's say it's something like this. We want this to go all the way from here to here, and there's no right way of doing things in Rive. That's the coolest bit about Rive. It's like puzzles that you can make on your own, and there's no right or wrong way of doing certain things. So in this case, the idea is it needs to be scalable, and the constraints need to be kept in mind when you're kind of designing these things. And the whole idea with Rive is not just to create tiny micro interactions, which is what I'd say is one part of what Rive is, but it's grown into this game engine over the last couple of months, and it's capable of doing so much more with handling data, and just you know processing different things and running things side by side, which I'll get to later on. So the next step in the process would be like figuring out what the constraints are and how does that affect the communication bit. And if it does affect it, you kind of go back and kind of relook at the whole project and see how else can we get this thing running, set up over keyframes. And There's something I live by a lot at Head Out, the kind of org I work at. Uh, the idea is that you before people jump in and start applying keyframes, the idea is you set things up. Think about rigging, but I wouldn't necessarily call it rigging. It's more about the architecture of things and how you build things. With Drive and the nature of how it works, for people who've had a few experience with this, the keyframes are very relative and not absolute. So, in case you don't have a keyframe on one timeline, you have it on another, it kind of can mess things up. So you need to be very thoughtful about how you're managing these things. For tiny projects like these, and where you have click interaction, it's a lot more easier to look at it. But when you have something that's a bit more broader in scope and scale, it gets a bit of a mess. Uh, so in this case, I'm taking the sun and the moon, and I basically made a star. So the idea is the sun itself would turn into the moon by just removing the the shine around it. And the other idea would be to also figure out, okay, how do we rig this to make sure it follows the same path? You can ideally keyframe it, or you could kind of make a bone that, to make sure both things are being driven by the same thing. Less keyframes also means less file size. So that also would help, later on during handoff. And again, it's almost efficient. And it's always efficient when you're dealing with low file sizes. Um, and the other idea would be, okay, we need when this goes to sleep, you're thinking, okay, we're gonna need this, the Z's popping out. So we have that in place as well, and just making sure that also follows the character as it moves. Um, and have other trinkets there, like the stars, which are again low on opacity, but it's there. So you kind of rig it up in a way. And the reason I say this comes before the rigging stage is because on a complex piece of project, you'd rather need to write this down on a piece of paper and figure out the architecture of things before you kind of jump in and just start laying it out, as it can get very messy real quick. So that is usually the setup of things. And so the animation is quite straightforward in Rive. I'm pretty sure people who have used it understand that you just animate it like you do in After Effects. So in this case, I've made like different states that handle different things. So when it's idle, there's nothing really happening. When there's a click, there's this that's going to happen. And we're dealing with something called blend states here. This bit, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with, but the idea with blend states is that you create a series of keyframes. So let's say this one is looking at this in one timeline, and another timeline you do the other way, right? The exact opposite of things. So it's like imagine two states, and the idea is that because these are driven by values here in the state machine of Rive, you can create an input, let's say a number input, and now this number can be used to drive that bit of morphing between the two. So when I add these things here, let's say I can add any of these, and then I turn it into a blend state. We'll add time. We don't need to capture. We need it. Let's add a base state, and we can leave it at two things. And basically, what these are is at what percentage or at what number do you get to the final output of this. And so I usually go with 100 because that's how you usually calculate percentages, and it's the easiest way to do it. But this is why setup again comes in handy, because we're dealing with hours and minutes and seconds. It's better to think about how the devs would think about this number as well, because you're kind of communicating the same language, unlike how you deal with Lottie. With Lottie, there's no number you deal with, right? You can always translate it to whatever number you want it to be. But with Drive, the idea is you deal with the same number, so that it's a lot more easier to debug things. And also when things get messy, it's a lot more easier to go back and change things. So I'm going to hit 24 here because that's the number of hours we have in a day, and that's how I want this to roll all the way here. And now you can see that as I move this and as the number increases, it kind of morphs between the two. But here's the issue, and this is again where, as I emphasized, setup comes in handy. Is the big issue here is that when it comes to the center, it's almost like the moon. It's almost the moon at 12 in the day, and that's not what we want, right? So the coolest thing about blend states is that you can add another state. It's not about having just two states. You could have three, four, how many ever you want. And let's say this is two, and I have another state here, which is basically this being in the center, and you still don't see any of the stars. And basically, we're transitioning between this and this in the next set, and the first one is basically between this and this timeline. So I want this to be at 12, the half of 24, and this to be at 24. And now that shows you like a visual morph of things. And now when I play it, you can see that it only starts to transition after 12, like it would in real life, right? So that's how blend states work. And the other cool thing about Rive is that you could have interactions and animations running parallel. That's what you call layers. Pretty sure people who work with 3D are familiar with animation layers, like Maya and Blender already has it. So Rive has something similar as a game engine would. And the idea is that you could have multiple interactions running parallel. And this is also where again setup comes in very handy because uh, the keyframes you have in here could directly influence the keyframes you have in another, you know, another animation layer that's running parallel. So you need to make those calls before you begin. Otherwise, again, things can get very messy. So let's say this is the state where we blend stuff together. And now let's say we need an animation where, uh, you know, the character is awake and it's basically blinking and you have a bit of shine on the sun, etc. So we've got that going. And let's say I want another animation where, you know, the character is sleeping and we've got no animation on these things. Again, the reason there's no animation on these things is because I haven't keyframed them. When you keyframe them, Rive takes it as something that it keeps in mind and doesn't change. It doesn't let me change anymore. Um, and because we have it in the blend state already where the color of the background changes, that kind of clashes with the other keyframe you have on the other timeline. So we have planned it out in a way where you know the keyframes that you have on some things don't directly interact with the keyframes on other thing while they're on parallelly. Um, Again, there are exemptions to this. You could do it. Well, let's say if you want like a snowfall to stop, or let's say there's rain to be happening, and at that point, I'd say you could keyframe between two to three things at one go just to make it things more efficient. But what I usually do is not keyframe everything on one go, and usually create like additional groups. So that gives me more control on like the scale and stuff. So that when I create like a click interaction and stuff, it's a lot more easier for me to handle jiggle and everything on that specific group, like a null, and not have it interact with other scaling that's happening. Like let's say the scaling of this shouldn't interact with, like shouldn't come in the way of like the jiggle and everything. So yeah, so now we have this, it's awake and you can see the animation is always playing. And thing is, we can have these things again, since it's almost like an algorithm and you're playing off of logic. You have, so we usually set it up in a way where we say, okay, let's set up a condition where we say, if the time is greater than 22, that is 10, I want to play this timeline, which is basically the character sleeping. And that gives us basically this, the moment it hits 21, nothing happens. 22, it goes to sleep. And we can also set up another side of the equation, and we can say, okay, if the time here is less than 8, then I want the character to go back to this timeline, basically meaning it's going to go back to being awake. So, and what you get is something like this. Now we could animate the transitions between the two as well. The reason I decided not to do it is, again, understanding the goal of the thing and during the setup, you kind of understand that the point of this thing is that it would be constrained to the actual time um, of the user, and as such, it's not entirely true that they would check the character's transitions at points. They would only see this at points, at different points, and the odds of them looking at it at that specific moment where it goes from being awake to sleep is very less. So you could almost skip that stage, but if you're really into really perfecting the things, you could always jump in, add a couple more timelines in there, make sure that transition's perfect, right? And yeah, so that's the basic of how we create the blend states. And blend state helps us in a lot of things. And I use this number a lot because it makes it so much more easier for me to talk to my devs and understand, you know, make sure the communication's a lot more easier. And now I can create another layer and add a click interaction, right? And what I've done is basically add a hitbox here, uh, which is almost like a shape that covers your area that you want it to be clickable. The reason you do this is two reasons. One, if it's a button, you'd usually want the finger size, even if they don't actually press the button, like it doesn't, the tolerance level of hit, the accuracy of hitting the button itself doesn't have to be true. So you can always increase the space that you give for, the user's fingers to tap to and stuff. And the other reason we do this is because you could directly keep it on the character so that you do get this bounding box to work with. But the issue is when you animate scale, the things we've seen with Rive is that the it doesn't really listen as well to the bounding box because the bounding box keeps changing. So it's rather better to have a dummy piece that you can use instead, and let the animation go. And even with the interactions, we have this one timeline where the character is doing nothing, and we have another one where the character basically jumps. And a key thing here is to always limit your workspace to wherever you have the animation ending. Uh, the reason we do this is because let's say I keep clicking on the character multiple times, Rive won't listen to it till this timeline stops. So unless you want this whole thing to play for a reason, it's always better to kind of trim it so that your user can tap it multiple times and get live and instant reaction. So yeah, so we set things up with like a listener here. You can access it over here, and you take the hitbox, and we say on pointer down. We have multiple options here. Pointer down. Let's fire a trigger, which is click. The difference between a trigger, boolean, the number, I think we already get the idea. The difference between a trigger and a boolean is, or the easiest way to understanding it is, a boolean goes to either true or false, but a trigger always goes from being true to false. So the moment it's almost in an instant, like it gets triggered and then it goes back to being false. So it's better for stuff where, um, let's say, you click on a button, and that's always one instance, right? Like the button doesn't, like, it's not like a door. With a door, it's almost like, is the door open or closed? That's a yes or no question. But with a button, it's like you click it and it's done. It comes back to its default state. For stuff like that, you usually use a trigger and not a boolean. Booleans have its own purposes, which we'll talk about later. So we basically have this thing, and we again give the condition that um, if there is a click on this hitbox, we want to play this animation. And once it's done, we can always drive it back to the idle state so that we can keep continuously clicking it. Without it, we can just do this, and then we can't do anything after that. The click just isn't working. And so what we can do is drive it back, and we say, once this is done, but it needs to be done 100%, right? Like if I just do this, nothing happens because it instantly goes to this and comes back to this, even though it doesn't really show it. So what we do is we add this thing called exit time, and what exit time is it basically runs the whole course of your workspace before taking in the condition that you added. And over here, I will say 100% of it. This is a cool thing because over here you can use match cuts. So let's say you have a ball that goes from one side to the other. Let me just quickly illustrate that. Let's say this goes to here and becomes like a square. And let's say we want to, again, the whole idea of Rive, and as we said, thinking about scalability and stuff, we'd, let's say, had to create like a loading state where this turns into like a square and then turns back into like a triangle. So we could use match cuts there, and we can randomize the whole thing. The idea would be this goes from here to here, and in the exit state we put it to 50%, right? So it reads from here half of this, and then the other half is being read from another timeline, and we get like the square. I wish I had more time to explain this, but uh, yeah, I think you get the gist once you play around with exit states. And then there's also documentation by Rive that I think would do a better job at explaining than I can. But yeah, so now all these things are running side by side. This is things that you can barely do in Lottie because Lottie works in a very linear fashion, right? To do something like this, you would have to build this as a separate Lottie component, this is a separate Lottie component, and the devs would have to struggle so much to make it pixel perfect. With this, you're building modular pieces that the design team has so much control over than the devs, and the interaction just keeps running now. And now I can just go ahead and I can export this file for runtime, which is .rive, of a backup. The backup is mostly for design use cases where you can, drag and drop it with back to Rive, and you can still access these things. Using it as a .rive doesn't let you do it anymore because of plagiarism issues that they've faced in the past. But this is what you use to, hand off the files to the devs. And before I jump into the how this works from the code side of things, which I just want to, run through really quick. Want to know if there's any questions.
If there are any questions, sorry, if there are any questions, like please feel free to drop it in the chat or start your mic and just ask away.
Okay, I'm guessing there isn't any. Let me know if I'm wrong. Should we continue?
Yeah, I think we could continue for now.
Got it. Yep. Cool. So
And we just got one question.
yep. Could you read it
Just
out?
read that out to you 1 second. So what exactly is the implementation method for the animation? The code in brackets, code software that adapts the preview of this.
I didn't get the question.
Niranjan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Elaborate it if needed.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I'll put in better words here. I'm mainly interested in knowing how you actually implement the final like whatever the preview that you've like ended up with. How do you implement it as well an actual interactable component in let's say a larger application or a use case scenario? Like, how does the method for that go about generally?
Got it. I think I'm coming to that in the next
Sorry.
thing. Got it. Yeah. It is similar, very similar to how we implement Lottie. There's a player, and you basically, uh, plug and play the RAW file that you have. Um, but again, as I said, because Rive-in is supposed to be, built for interactions, uh, there's a lot more, heavy duty stuff that you can do than you can do with Lottie. So now the coolest bit about Rive is that the listeners you have here, they work within the bounds of these canvas, right? So I don't have to write any code, and the click interaction works, right? That's absolutely beautiful. So most of your things, like all the things that you can see in here, like let's say, trying to hit this, you know, pointer move, click, pointer up, pointer exit. You can use a lot of these things to create a lot of the interactions uh, within the bounds of this canvas, and it would work flawlessly, right? Because and it's the exact same thing that you see from whatever you have on your canvas here to whatever's being picked here. It's almost exactly the same. Now, let's say we need the whole point of this Rive though, and the reason I like Rive is working at a larger scale. The amount of times we would use stuff like this is really nice, but most of the time it's more like Easter eggs. And at least for me, it's always been Easter eggs. And to work at scale, it's always been having to deal with data. I'm guessing there's a question.
Hey, you can go ahead. You can start your mic and ask the question.
I think they accidentally left the call.
Okay, let's just continue for now then, and we'll take it later.
Got it. So yeah, as I was saying, the interactions work absolutely perfect inside of these bounds. And there's a specific reason I say inside these bounds, because when you have a mouse move interaction, where let's say your character's eyes move with your mouse, that only works within the bounds of these, right? The moment you go out of it, Rive has no actual, um, control over it. And that's where you would use a lot of the dev help to get things done. And also for me, I think working at scale, you're looking at more dynamic content as well, and you kind of work hand in hand with whatever the devs have. So the easiest way to think about this is basically the devs have nothing more to do other than referencing the state machine here and then the artboard. So if you have multiple artboards, you can always pre-comp them in here. They're called nested artboards in Rive, but the basic idea is um, you can take this and you can come to this and you can have this here and you can animate it going forward. And the coolest thing is this is still interactable inside of this. So you can build interactions inside of interactions instead of interactions. To be a bit more mindful about doing things like that, it would create a loop that's not intended. But yeah, also in those cases, they just had to specify which artboard they're using and which state machine we're referencing, so that it's a lot more easier for us to get the inputs out of it. And so let's say based off of that input, I'm taking the input named time here, which is basically this number, and let's say I make it 23. Let's reload this, and the characters are asleep. And let's say I do something like 12. Let's reload this, and the characters, it's at the dead center. Now this is more like manual implementation of the time. What the dev can do here, and what this gives us control over, is just uh, going here and saying, okay, I can now write a code that says, okay, I want to get the hours here, because that's what we're dealing with, just the hours, right? We don't need the minutes and the stuff. So I can just get the hours here, and I can just put that in here. And now, yep, this state is based off of whatever my current time is, and it will keep changing uh, as and when the time moves. So you've actually basically created a whole widget with just like a couple of lines of code. And even if you have a dev working on this, it's a lot more easier for him to understand. It's a lot more easier for us to read as well, right? Like it's a lot more easier for me to hit 12 here and understand what's happening, rather than doing it with other stuff like Lottie or playing an MP4, where you're kind of converting frames to something and then you have to translate to something, just so that you guys are on the same communication channels. But with this, it's so much more easier to do it this way. So this is one way to do it, and you can't really notice the difference in minutes, because we're only taking the hours. So let's save ourselves a bit more time, and let me show you what else we can do, and why I like uh, this idea of having um, the blend states. The coolest thing is we can figure out the whole thing out with a scroll function as well. So what you're basically doing is understanding how big the whole your whole screen is, the height of the whole screen, and we're basically playing it based off of that. So let's say let's reload this, and as you can see, as I scroll, it just changes. This is probably not the right animation to demo this, but think about your this scrolly telling animations that you see on Apple's websites and stuff like that. This is so much easier to achieve now with this, and this doesn't have to completely be the screen size. The dev can choose to just put the height of the div, and as soon as the div stops, it stops animating, and it can be sticky and it can go back. So we can do stuff like this, and it's so much more easy to access these things, and you also understand what exactly is happening because you're again talking the same numbers. You're basically writing 24, which is this exact number that you've used. So it's a lot more easier to understand it that way. And the coolest thing about Rive again is again, as I said, working at scale. So let's think about it this way: we're dealing with calendars, we're dealing with time, and if the whole idea of your thing is to give delight and micro interactions and all that, it'd be nice to have Easter eggs in there that really um, can add that bit of user delight on like certain let's say situations. And one of the things I can think of is like holiday season, right? That's a great way for your brand as well to stand out, and can really bring together the marketing and the product divisions together. So how would that work? Well, in Rive it's a lot more easy because we can always have simultaneous animations running. So what it means is that uh, this whole widget can keep running on its own, and we can have another animation layer basically where in design we have a couple of things that's happening here. Let me just bring these back real quick. So let's say for Christmas season we want uh, a little character here to look like Santa. So I probably have like a cap and a mustache, and now I'd create two different timelines where the opacity is the only thing that's changing, right? There's no opacity on the hat, there's no opacity on the mustache. And I'll create another timeline called Christmas, and I'll add the opacity back up. Again, I have to think about the scope of work. I could transition between the two, but let's think about this. This happens almost instantly when you hit 12, right, on your thing. And the odds of people waiting for this widget to, make that bit of transition is very low. So you can almost always skip that bit. But again, if you're required, you can always kind of find that transition between the two and make it a lot more smoother. That's what Rive lets you do. Like you're the artist, and Rive is just a tool. You can use it however. And now this is where stuff like booleans come in handy. So let's say I have a thing that says Christmas as a boolean, and again the same condition applies. Christmas is true, then I see this timeline playing, right? And let's say I had another thing which says Christmas is false, then I want nothing. So now when I play it, there's nothing. But when I hit Christmas is on, I can see it. And this is also why the setup thing is important, because I put it in a way where this doesn't you know uh, collide with my other interactions that I've built, be it the click interaction or the way we work with the blend states. Everything is still held tight. Now let's say how does it work with the devs, right? They don't have to manually do anything. They can just go here and they can say, well, let's bring this back up as well. Now let's say this time of the day, and if the date is this and if the month is this, then we want the value of Xmas to be true, otherwise we want to be false. Simple as that, and it will do the job. So it's a one-time thing for the devs as well. They just have to write, if this is the case, then it happens, and it will just automatically happen every year. And we can keep building on more things. Of course, we don't see it now because we're on a different date. I can just hit 31 and the month to be 8. That should give us. Why is it 8? I'm not sure. Okay. Is that what an easier way for me to show this is just say this is false and this is true. And there you go. And it will still follow the same pattern. Now you can create multiple customized versions of these. You can have like one for Thanksgiving, one for Halloween, a lot of different instances, one for New Year's maybe. So whatever you want, and you can build the brand together that way. You can also use the same idea to create like personalized character avatars on your profile pages where people can click and customize things. Basically, how that would work is you would cache in, or like you would take in the user input of whatever number they pick here. It could be 2, could be having a mustache. 3 could be having like a cat maybe, or something else. And this number we'd have to send it to the backend along with the username, and whatever their preferences are. And every time they see it, we're basically referencing this number from the backend. So a lot more easy for us to work with, a lot of customizing options. So yep, that's it about with this particular demo. Let me know if there's any questions.
Yeah, Roshan, I also just want to give you an update on the time. It's 5:18 right now.
Mhm.
In case you wanted to know.
Got it. Yeah, I'll wrap it up. I'm guessing there's no questions. I'll move ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions right now. If you guys have any questions, you can also type it out in the chat. We can take it up later also. I
Got it.
think for now we can move on to the next one.
Cool. The other way of working with this is with Framer. Framer and Audio go hand in hand with each other. So the coolest thing is you can just go generate share link here, and we can generate a link, and it will generate this link. So you can have a share link, an embed link, an embed code that's an iframe. You can also copy this Framer code. The coolest thing is this interactive canvas can also be integrated on your Behance, and it would still be interactive. So you can make more interactive portfolios as well, especially for product that's a lot more easier to do than having GIFs and the Adobe XD prototypes and stuff. So what you would basically do is take that bit of code, and you go in here and you say, let's say it's the time widget. Let's camel case this, and let's create a new component, and we'll copy all this and we'll replace it with this piece of code. And now when we let it do its thing for a minute, and as you can see, it works. I can go in here and I can take that time widget and I can drop it here. And when I preview this, it's basically interactive, right? And it also gives me all the information I need. So the time of the day, etc., is can still be handled here if required. So let's say on click, I want this to change time to night. That's also possible to do. You just make a component out of this and make a variant where this changes time, and you can kind of switch between those two. So that's how well Framer and Rive has been integrated. Again, I'm not going to dive deep into this because there's documentation specifically for this. But the coolest thing about Rive and Framer integration is this link. You can hit Command and open this up, and this gives you all the properties. So all the code that you wrote here can still be accessed here, even though you can't access it here. So copy all this, make a new component. Let's call this widget code, and we'll add this here. And now let's go to the time widget, and we can take all these off. And we'll just say widget code dot tsx. And that should, is that not working? Yeah, and it's still the exact same thing. But now the coolest thing is you can change a lot of things here, like whatever properties you want. So it gives you a lot more control. than what you would with just having this component that we were given in the beginning. We can do a lot more cool things as well. For the interest of time, I've actually had this thing here. Now, this piece doesn't has the same bit of thing that's running with this. So now I can go to that. Right, and we can start changing these things here. So let's get back on scroll, and every time I scroll on this page, it should change, and it does. Only difference is that over here I'm using vanilla JavaScript, over here you'd have to use React, but most of the code is almost very, very identical. So it's a lot more easier for even the designers to understand what exactly is happening with the code. So now let's say I take these off for the scroll, and I can still come back and use the time effect if required, and you'll get the same result on Framer. See? And now, so for the mouse move, especially on Framer, you won't be able to do mouse movements like things that follow your the mouse, the character that follows your mouse, etc. That won't happen outside of this canvas. So what I usually recommend is to create blend states for like on the x-axis, on the y-axis, whichever one is easier, and then we basically use this bit of code to kind of basically morph between the two just based off of how I'm moving my mouse. Very limited code, and this is publishable like any moment now. That's how simple it is, and this works to the breadth of the viewport. So imagine your character, looking at the cursor outside of this bounding box as well. So that's how well Rive is integrated with Framer. I'm going to give a very fast sneak peek on a more complex animation that we've done. I hope we have the time for this. Let me know if it's not the case.
Yeah, we do have time for this. You can go ahead.
Got it. Right. So we had this piece of animation where we kind of want to show how many users the website got and the rating and the cities the website's in. The big issue here is that this number keeps changing almost every 2-3 months, and to keep coming back and changing things manually, that's going to take absolutely forever. And it's also a lot of work, both from the dev side and from the design side. So we had to figure out a way to make this like really efficient to work with. One thing we did was like come up with like a turntable of this logo that the brand has, so that it's a lot more easy to work with. So what we basically did is we nest the artboard like we did, like I showed previously, instead of using the whole state machine, which gives you interactions, etc. But in this case, we don't have interactions. So what we can do is instead pick, timelines. Let's say we can hit remap, and what this does basically, you have the rotating blimp in, it's basically like time remapping in After Effects. But you can also create multiple versions of these. So let's say I want the color of it to change, and I've made another timeline where the color goes from white to purple based off of wherever it is in the timeline. So I can just go here and hit 50% and it changes color, but that won't affect the other one because I have not placed keyframes on the other, so it doesn't really constrain itself just to that, and it gives you a blimp that can change its colors. And this is so much easier for the dev to implement. He doesn't even have to do anything. He doesn't have to add another lotify. He doesn't have to do anything. He just has to so we've set up a boolean that basically says if it's white or not, and if it is, it turns to white. Okay. Yeah, it basically turns to white, and if not, it just stays. Yep. So that's kind of how this was built, and the building was very complex, but it kind of is on almost the similar lines of what I showed before, but it's just a lot more connections that's happening and a lot more like animations running in parallel. So yeah, and the way the scene is built is just basically using these things called solos. Um, what solos usually does is it goes almost like a frame by frame sequence. It's like your toggle hold keyframe on After Effects, but uh, being done in a way where it's almost instant. So you're basically jumping frames without having to, toggle hold stuff. So let's say we have this, and then we have another one, this here, and let's put both these uh, in a solo group, which you can access here, and we can put them under it. So what you end up getting is like a radio button, and it's basically either between this or this, and you can pick between those two cases. And the whole scene is set up in that way so that we can jump between 2 or 3 scenes quite easily, and helps helps in organization and again later debugging and stuff. Uh, the big issue here is the numbers. We had to have the numbers be dynamic so that we can always alter them. So we can't use SVGs as numbers. We could have compiled SVGs as numbers and kind of placed them in a way, but we didn't really see a lot of change in file size. So with this, it's a lot more easier to do it. So what we basically did is we took a path. Let me just re-rig this for the so we took a path that's something like this, and basically you draw it out like I usually draw a path. But the coolest thing about Rive is you can have bones that basically can move things. What happened? All right. Oh, let's put the bones back on. Yeah. So we have 2 bones here. Let's okay. Something broke. Yeah. So let's place this over here, and let's place this one over here. The whole idea is that now the path becomes easier to animate. In After Effects, think of this as having your pin tool, but with a lot more control. So from here on, we basically say bind bones, and we pick these bones, and we start weight painting them like you do in 3D softwares. So let's say if this is 100% like this, and this one's the 100% of this. And now when we move these things, the line, we can change the path and stuff. Now I can come here and I can constrain the path of this to this, and now this will stick with that. I don't want it to orient. What orient does is basically take the angle of the path. We don't want that. So now when I move the bone, you get this. So what we basically did, we duplicated a bunch of these, and in the path, like you do with the After Effects points follow nulls, or the points follow path in this case, you you can set to what percentage you want this to move, and you basically fill this up with like 10 of these, because again, you have to think about the scope of work as well. In this case, this will be played almost at a very tiny level on the navbar. So having almost like 100 of these doesn't make sense. You could get away with even having these jagged edges because nobody's going to see it at that scale. So yeah, we create a bunch of these, And for this one, and now when we change this, we move it around, we get something like this. So this gives you a lot more control, and you can kind of see how that fake 3D text was made. Now, there's two ways to go about changing this text. One way we thought of doing this was to just use the text run here, and the text run here, and the text run here. The issue is that we had almost 5 digits to animate. Sorry, 6 digits to animate, and yeah, sorry, 5. And all of them would have this text run, and you'd have to like get them individually. Like, so each digit would have 10 of these instances, and you had to get the run of each instance and really make it work. That's a lot of work for the dev side. And the whole idea of Rive is to make it easier. So what we decided to do is instead we made more timelines where we basically took the value of these things, made it 1, and we made another timeline where the value of this is basically 2. And we made another one in similar fashion. Yep, there you go. And now what we did is, instead of having it to the entry state, we picked the any state. And what the any state means is that it keeps running in a loop and not the side of entry. What that means is that you can play something out of anywhere and not really from the beginning. So we had a bunch of these. And what this means is that you can change between these at any given point in time that the entry doesn't let you do. And we had another, and now we add the number again. And what I'll say here is I'll take this number and I'll say if it's equal to 1, I want to play 1. And the same thing here. If it's equal to 2, I want to play 2. And if it's equal to 3, I want to play 3. And now when we play it and change the value, this is not working. Brilliant. And this is what I usually mean by debugging, especially on complex projects like these. Yes, really hard sometimes to kind of know why things are breaking. Should be working. Yeah, now it works. Yeah, there we go. So we're basically changing these things this way, and we basically have like a bunch of these stacked up. And what this also means is that we can create that bit of shape where you can make that 4 3D kind of turn by just using these bones. And this is also where the setup comes in handy. We had this whole thing set up in a way where we kind of had the whole thing bounded by a group, so that we can still add a bit of that squash and stretch without hurting the bones and the way this is moving. So we usually have like something like this, so that there's still a midpoint that we can always reference. So yeah, that's how this piece was built. And we had like multiples of these, as you can see, loads of these, and we had different scenes that was playing up. That's like playing almost like they would in After Effects in a very linear fashion, but we're using solos instead to kind of jump between each scene. So it makes it a lot more easier and organized to jump between timelines. And now that we have this, I can just come here and change the number of users to, let's say, from 40 to, I want to say 25. And there you go, it changes. And let's change this to 60. So yeah, that's how this works. And even the build of this is kind of similar. You just put it up and you kind of get these inputs. And I've added these numbers manually, but what the dev would do is basically go to the backend and kind of figure out how many users you have. And it's so much easier for them to get that number, break that digit down with JavaScript to 2 digits, and then just apply them here. So that from that array, So it's a lot more easier to work with, and it's so much easier to scale up, and saves a lot of time. So yep, I guess that covers everything I wanted to talk in this session. So let me know if there's any questions.
Thanks, Roshan. That was that's really a in-depth view on Rive-in. It was also quite simple and easy to follow. So thank you for doing this. We have a couple of
No,
questions on chat. I'll just read it out. Yeah, so Rishabh asks, I've basically been creating 3D animations and recently have been facing challenges while creating for web and mobile-based 3D animations. So I'm trying to learn a lot of E or Rive to understand. Is any of them better, better in optimizing the file size?
so with Drive, you can kind of do it. Let me share my screen real quick and show you one instance where we've done it, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. But for something 3D uh, on the web, I think we'd rather be using WebGL. Um, there is Spline, but Spline does have its limitations with what we've seen, mostly the file size and the load time is very slow uh, when compared to other, like just having plain WebGL or 3JS. So it probably use that. 3JS kind of get it's a bit intimidating to start with, but I've seen that it's a bit more easier to implement. So might give that a try as well. With Drive, however, there is a way of figuring this out. Let me quickly find the file I was looking for. Yeah, so we made this 3D test some time back, and the idea is that we basically get frames, like different a lot of frames, that's 3D rendered, and basically we connect it to this joystick that works just like joysticks and sliders does. And basically, as you interact with it, you're basically rotating the 3D thing. But sorry, but again, it's almost like you're faking it because it's just pictures that's just changing. It's something that a lot of we use it for like video scrubbing on websites where you scroll down and the video keeps playing. I would say it's almost the similar logic. You're not really using the actual 3D stuff inside of Rive, and I don't think Lottie and Rive both support native 3D, so you'd have to probably fake it in some way or the other.
I would hope that answers your question, Rishabh. There's another question by Gautam. How do you make sure the space between numbers are consistent, since one would probably be thinner than nine? I think this is about the last project that you were
Yeah,
showing.
got it. Well, in our case, it didn't really matter because we do have the bones to control the two ends of the path, and the idea is that we're kind of faking 3D. So the idea is like it always comes behind the things. Do you mean two different digits, or do you mean the extrusion? Like,
I was asking about the two different digits
okay,
because
got it.
extrusion I get is from the bones,
Mhm,
whereas the let's say the top part of the bone, the
mhm.
position has to be set manually. I guess, right?
Yep, kind you'd have to. But then I think these are constraints that you'd have to work with on the web anyways, because
Mhm.
I think these are like designers' worst nightmares on the web. Like especially with fonts, there are parts where they never usually align properly because they usually have their own bounding boxes to work with. So even with Drive, even if we rig it in a way where we say this follows the ends of this bounding box itself, I don't think it would be true to that bounding box because of all the animation that's happening. But at the same time, it's moving so quick. I don't think you'd notice that bit of difference as well. And also, the extrusion kind of helps give that illusion of not having that a lot of space. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's all about like working with the constraints you have and like kind of using some trickery to uh, you know make it work.
If anybody else has any questions, you can unmute and ask. I actually had a question. So when you were working at stuff and you work like head out, is it necessary that you work on Drive or in places where you can work with Lottie? Do you guys do that? Or is it strictly
Uh,
just Drive?
we began with Lottie. We still have Lottie on almost, I think, uh, almost like 50% of the code base still runs Lottie. We're in the process of shifting it from Lottie to Rive. So after this, I think we stick with just working with one over having two different things. Main reason is because Lottie player is heavy, and so is Rive.
Mhm.
Rive is bigger in that comparatively, and even though the file size of the files are less, we have seen that the file size of the player is a bit bigger than what we have in Lottie. So having both of them on the code base would just bloat up the load times, and on an app it doesn't really work. So we had to pick
Mhm.
one.
Okay.
Alright.
I had a question as well.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask if you wanted to add a Rive file to your website, which is made on Wix or Squarespace, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that something that's doable
Yep, you
or
can.
like easily doable?
Yes, yes. Like when I showed you the generate link, let me just share my thing real quick. Um, so what you basically do is, let's say I go here. I actually go to Behance real quick so that I can kind of show how you would embed things like this, because uh, there's, I think, other than Framer, there's not a lot of software that has this amount of implementation, like ease of implementation. So what you'd end up using is more like an iframe or an embed link. What from my understanding of it is basically like a window into the canvas that you're using. So let's say we create a project in here, and I can go to the editor here and I can say generate link. So you got this embed link and another embed code. We can take this iframe code uh, here, and you can go to the embed here, and you can just paste your embed code and hit embed and wait for Behance to do its thing, and there you go. And it's still interactive.
That's great. That's great. And does it work the same way for if you were to embed it on any website?
Yeah.
Any. Okay.
Wix, yes, almost the same. It has this itself.
Right.
Yeah, while it's embeddable, is there any limitation on like passing the numbers and inputs like that? Like,
Yeah. With an iframe, you really can't, because, like I said, it's just a window to whatever Rive is showing. So you can't. You're not exactly, like you don't really have that file on there. It's more like smoke and mirrors. This is just my understanding. I'm pretty sure the developers would have a better way of explaining this, but no. Short answer, no, you can't do that. With Framer, you can, because of the implementation. Like, they work very well with each other, and the way they work is that they give you a file that's shared on the web, and there's a component that you can use to get the parameters out. Um, with stuff like this, you're basically, again, just showing a window and you're just playing that animation, and it's interactive because, like I said, whatever's within the bounds of this canvas is always interactive in Rive. So that's one big pro of using Rive for stuff like these.
we're trying to do something like this in Webflow.
Hmm.
Uh, is it the same? Like we have to use embeds in Webflow, or is there, because Webflow we can add any bit of code, right? So
Yeah.
is there a better way to do that in Webflow?
I haven't actually had much experience working with Webflow, so I might not be the right person to answer this. But if there is a way you can, add the Rive player, uh,
Mhm.
just like you would add GSAP on Webflow, right?
Huh.
If you could
Right.
add, um, the Rive player in there. I don't see why it's not possible. I think
It should be, I
because
guess, yeah.
Webflow has more control with code and how it works more than Framer. So I'm guessing it should be possible. But as far as I've seen, people do limit themselves to just using the embed links. But again, might be worth a shot, I guess. I've never actually tried it. I know Spline has a good implementation between the two.
Okay.
If anyone else has any questions, please go ahead and ask away. Okay, I guess people don't have any questions right now. But yeah, I think if that's all, then we can start wrapping up then. Thank you so much, Roshan, for taking out the time to do this. And thank you everyone for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. We had a good turnout and we were happy to see everyone over and some familiar faces as well. Again, the links to our socials, the links to Roshan's socials and work is in the chat, and you can go check those out, give them a follow. We'll be uploading this talk after some time, say next week. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I think thank you so much again, Roshan, for taking out the time to do this.
Thank you for the
And
opportunity,
thanks, everyone.
and thanks for showing up, everyone. I hope this helped in some way or the other.
Definitely, I think it definitely did. Yeah.
Thanks again,
Cool.
Roshan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'll see you guys.